The locker room underneath America West Arena smelled like liniment oil, wet towels, and something harder to name. Ambition, maybe. Or the particular tension that builds in a small space when men who have spent their entire lives becoming exceptional gather together before the moment that separates good from historic. The Phoenix Suns had made it to the NBA Finals for the first time in franchise history, and the weight of that sat on every shoulder, pressed against every chest, made the air thicker than it needed to be. It was Game 5, June 1993. The series was tied 2 games apiece, and what had been expected to be a coronation, Michael Jordan claiming his 3rd consecutive championship, had instead become something genuinely uncertain. The league had watched the first 4 games with the collective stunned expression of people who'd bet their mortgage on something they'd considered inevitable and were starting to sweat. Charles Barkley was the reason for that uncertainty. There are athletes the world produces once a generation, athletes whose gifts are so specific, so refined to a single purpose, that they seem almost custom-built by nature for one role. Barkley at 30 years old was that kind of athlete. 6 feet 4 inches, and somewhere between 250 and 260 pounds, depending on who was asking and what mood Charles was in when he answered. His body defied most conventional understanding of basketball physics. He was too short to be a power forward by any classical measurement. Too wide, too heavy, too earthbound. When scouts had evaluated him coming out of Auburn in 1984, several had noted with careful professional language that his dimensions were, quote, not ideal for the perimeter game required at the next level. Charles had carried those assessments with him for 9 years, and he had transformed each one into fuel. He was the league MVP that season. Not honorary, not sentimental, not by committee, by performance. Barkley had averaged 25 points, 12 rebounds, and nearly 5 assists per game through the regular season, and he had done it by refusing to accept the limitations everyone had agreed he should have. He played with a barely contained violence, a physical insistence that made every moment he spent on a basketball court feel like an argument he was winning in real time. He didn't move around defenders. He moved through them. He didn't position himself for rebounding opportunities. He simply went and got the ball as though it belonged to him, and everyone else was just borrowing it. And before Game 5, in a corridor outside the Suns' locker room with a cluster of reporters and a camera positioned to catch everything, Charles Barkley said the words that would define the next 48 hours. "Jordan," he said, his voice carrying that particular Alabama warmth that never quite left him, regardless of how long he'd been in Philadelphia or how many years he'd spent in Phoenix. "Jordan is the best player I've ever seen. I'll give him that. But tonight, in this building, with my team behind me, try to stop me. Just try." He said it without performance, without theater. It wasn't trash talk in the traditional sense. It was closer to a statement of fact. A man who had watched film, who had calculated angles, who understood with the mathematical certainty of someone who'd studied the equation for a decade that his advantages over Jordan were real and measurable and exploitable. Charles Barkley outweighed Michael Jordan by nearly 50 pounds. He could back him down from the post, could use that advantage to create separation that skill alone couldn't close. He had proven it in 4 games already. The series was evidence. The reporters wrote it down, and by evening it was on every sports broadcast, every radio call-in show, every barbershop and office and sports bar in America. Charles Barkley had challenged Michael Jordan, and the challenge was genuine. Jordan saw the clip in the early afternoon, sitting in his hotel room with Scottie Pippen eating room service. He watched it twice. He didn't say anything. He picked up a French fry, ate it, and turned the television off. Pippen looked at him. "You good?" Jordan looked at the blank screen for another moment. "Yeah," he said. "I'm good." What Pippen thought about that expression on Jordan's face, he would describe years later in an interview as the most frightening thing he had witnessed in his basketball career, and he had witnessed a great deal. There was no anger in it, no urgency, no insistence. It was something much worse. It was the calm of a man who had already solved the problem and was simply waiting for the scheduled time to implement the solution. America West Arena at tip-off was a physical sensation. 19,000 people compressed into a space engineered to amplify sound, and the sound was enormous. Suns fans had waited decades for this, and they arrived wearing purple and orange with the particular fervor of people who understood that history was available to them if they could just hold on for 48 minutes. The noise was constant, layered, a living thing that vibrated in the sternum and made conversations impossible at normal volume. The Bulls moved through their pre-game warm-ups with the practiced ease of a team that had been here before. They'd been to the finals 3 years running. They knew how this felt, knew how to metabolize the crowd's energy without being consumed by it. Scottie Pippen was loose and fluid, working his mid-range game off the glass. Horace Grant was talking himself through post footwork, quiet and focused. And Jordan was doing what Jordan always did before the biggest moments of his career, which was to appear almost bored. He shot pull-up jumpers from the elbow, catching his own rebounds, going back to the same spot, creating a rhythm so ordinary it seemed almost meditative. Charles Barkley watched him from across the court with an expression that mixed respect with something shrewd and calculated. He'd studied Jordan the way military strategists study terrain before an engagement. He knew the tendencies, the preferences, the situations Jordan could be steered into that would favor the larger man. When your opponent is faster and has a better perimeter game, you take the game to the post. You make it a wrestling match. You make it a test of leverage and positioning, and the kind of brutish persistence that had been Barkley's entire professional identity. When the opening tip happened and the game began, Barkley made good on everything he'd promised. He was relentless in the post, backing Jordan down with those powerful glutes and that low center of gravity that made him almost impossible to move. He scored on the first possession, a short hook that arched perfectly over Jordan's outstretched hand. He scored on the third possession, a drop-step baseline that left Jordan a step behind. By the first media timeout, Barkley had 8 points and was absolutely shouting inside. "Come on, Mike," he said as they walked to their respective huddles. "I told you, you can't stop this. I'm too big, I'm too strong, and I'm right here all night." Jordan looked at him with that same expression Pippen had described, the solved problem expression. He said nothing. What happened next is the part that people who were there still struggle to fully articulate when they try to explain it years later. It wasn't a moment, it was a process. A slow, methodical, almost surgical dissection that unfolded across 12 minutes of basketball, in a way that left people in the arena gradually understanding they were watching something that would not come around again. Jordan stopped trying to guard Barkley as a power forward. He stopped trying to prevent Barkley from getting the ball, stopped trying to crowd him out of his positioning. Instead, he did something that looked counterintuitive from the outside. He gave Barkley the space, conceded the first step, made the larger man work to create his own angles. And while Barkley was working, while he was backing down, while he was calculating the geometry of the post, Jordan was doing something else entirely. He was gathering information. Every player in the NBA had a rhythm. Barkley's was precise, almost metronomic. 3 dribbles, gather, 2 options, right-handed hook or drop-step baseline. He'd scored 10,000 points in that league on those 2 plays. They were as fundamental to Charles Barkley as breathing, as reliable as the physics of the thing. Jordan cataloged it with the first possession, confirmed it with the second. And by the third time Barkley caught the ball in the post in the second quarter and began his backing down process, Jordan was no longer defending where Barkley was. He was already at where Barkley was going. The steal was invisible to most of the crowd because it didn't look like a steal. It looked like Barkley had simply lost the ball in a crowd of bodies, a momentary fumble during routine contact. But the camera caught it clearly. Jordan had known the drop step was coming. He had positioned his hand against the grain, below where Barkley expected any resistance to exist, and in the moment of commitment when the ball came off the dribble and Barkley's body committed to the baseline, Jordan's hand was already there. Not grabbing, not reaching, just waiting, precisely placed, so that Barkley's own momentum drove the ball out of his grip. Jordan went 85 feet in 5 seconds. The bucket at the other end came from a move so effortless it seemed almost gentle. Barkley straightened up at the other end of the court and looked at the scorer's table, and you could see something adjusting in his expression. Not defeat, not anything close to defeat, more like recalibration. He was a professional. He'd been in this league a long time. Things happened that required you to update your model, and he updated. He called for the ball deeper in the post next time, changed the entry angle, adjusted the 3 dribbles to 4 to disrupt whatever timing mechanism Jordan had identified. He muscled up a turnaround jumper from 10 feet that went in, and the Suns' bench erupted, and he pointed once toward midcourt as he ran back, not at Jordan, just a general gesture toward the universe that said this wasn't over. And it wasn't. That's what made it extraordinary. Because Jordan didn't respond by scoring. He responded by making Barkley score and then making that score irrelevant. He took Kevin Johnson off the dribble 6 seconds later, drew the foul, and went to the line so relaxed he might have been practicing alone in a gym. He made both. He pulled up from 18 feet on the next possession, a jumper so clean and automatic it looked like he was demonstrating, like this was an instructional video, and he was showing the correct technique. He made it. The Bulls ran a screen roll action, and Jordan came off it and hit a pull-up at the foul line before the defense had even decided what it was supposed to be doing. It wasn't a run. It was more disorienting than that. Runs have energy, have crowd involvement, have a feeling of acceleration. Jordan's method in the second quarter felt more like arithmetic. He was simply resolving a problem efficiently, without drama, without any indication that this required particular effort. Each Jordan basket felt like the inevitable output of a process that was already complete. By halftime, Jordan had 22 points. The Bulls led by 7. Barkley had 18 points on genuine hard-earned work, and he sat in the Suns' locker room during the break with a towel over his head and said nothing for 4 minutes. His coaches charted adjustments. They showed him film of the first steal, the hand placement, the anticipation. His assistant coach pointed to the screen and said, "He's reading your dribble count. He knows the drop step is coming on 3. Barkley watched it again. The third time he nodded slowly and said, "He was already there. He was already there before I decided to go." The second half. This is what people remember. This is what got stored in the permanent record. Barkley came out with adjustments that were legitimate and intelligent. He took Jordan into 5 post possessions in the third quarter and varied his approach each time, changing his rhythm, changing his pivot, going away from his dominant hand twice, things that veteran post players almost never do because the reliable move is reliable for a reason. He scored on 3 of them. He was competing at a level that should have been enough. Jordan answered with something that had no analog in prior experience. He started scoring from places that physics suggested were suboptimal. He hit a fallaway jumper from the left baseline with Danny Ainge's hand in his face, a shot that had no logical reason to go in based on the geometry of the body position and the defensive contest. It went in. He drove left, which was supposed to be his weaker hand, drew Barkley's help rotation, and hit Horace Grant cutting baseline for an and one that Grant finished with the kind of reliable efficiency of someone who knew exactly when the ball was coming. He pulled up from 23 feet off 2 dribbles, not a play the Bulls had designed, not a set they'd practiced, just a read he made in real time because the defender was half a step too far in, and Jordan calculated the math before the defender's brain had even registered the option was available. And still, Barkley would not break. He came down the other end and scored. Again. He was 7 for 12 in the second half, throwing everything he had at a man who had apparently already processed what everything looked like and filed it accordingly. The crowd was feeling both things simultaneously, the pride in what their man was doing and the growing dread of understanding that it might not matter, that they were watching someone operate in a register that Barkley's considerable gifts could not quite access. With 4:20 left, the Bulls leading by 9, Jordan took an inbound pass, held the ball for 2 full seconds longer than any player in the league holds the ball in late-game situations, and the audacity of those 2 seconds sent a ripple through the arena. He was counting, calculating, filing. Dan Magerle was closing out hard because he'd learned that Jordan shot the 3 if given a step. Jordan pump faked once. Magerle left his feet. Jordan drew the contact as he rose, went to the line, made both. 11 points. 3 minutes left. Barkley scored twice more. He never stopped competing, and there was something genuinely moving about that. Something that the announcers tried to name and couldn't quite find the language for. This enormous man refusing to accept mathematics, pouring himself into the effort with the absolute conviction that if you just keep working the problem, the answer can change. Jordan responded both times. He didn't celebrate, didn't gesture toward the crowd or toward Barkley. He ran back on defense and got set and waited with that expression that Pippen had described and that everyone courtside had seen by now. The expression of a man who had solved the problem before the game started and was simply here to execute the solution. Bulls won by 12. Jordan finished with 41 points, 6 rebounds, and 6 assists. In the handshake line afterward, Barkley took Jordan's hand and held it for a moment longer than the situation required. He looked at him, and Jordan looked back, and whatever passed between them in that moment was private, but everyone surrounding them could feel the weight of it. "You were in my head," Barkley said. "I made adjustments, and you'd already made adjustments to my adjustments. How long you been studying me?" Jordan almost smiled. "Charles, I've been studying you since 1984. Barkley shook his head slowly. He looked at the floor, then back up. "That's not a game plan, man. That's surgery." Jordan released his hand, and the handshake line moved on, and reporters surged forward with microphones and questions, and the general chaos of meaningful moments being converted into news cycle content. But Barkley stood still for a few extra seconds at midcourt, and the arena was emptying around him, and he had the expression of someone who had just received an answer to a question he had been asking his entire career. He had not been humiliated by Jordan's athleticism, not beaten by faster legs or a superior vertical. He had been dismantled by homework, by preparation so thorough and detailed that Jordan had walked into Game 5 already knowing what Charles Barkley was going to do before Charles Barkley decided to do it. The chess match had ended before tip-off. The next 48 minutes were just Jordan executing a conclusion he had already reached. In the locker room, surrounded by the quiet, specific grief of a series that was now 3-2 against them with everything they would need to do to extend it, Barkley sat on the bench and stared at his hands. One by one, his teammates dressed and filtered out. Coaches gave him space. Eventually, it was just Charles and the assistant who handled his post-game treatment, and the assistant kept quiet because he understood the situation. He was the biggest, strongest, most physically gifted power forward of his generation. He had won the MVP award. He had brought a franchise to the finals for the first time in its history. He had scored 28 points tonight against the best perimeter defender in the world, and he had done every single thing his body knew how to do. And it wasn't enough. Not because his body had failed him, not because his gifts were insufficient, but because the man across from him had done something more fundamental than train his body. He had trained his mind, specifically, completely, to understand Charles Barkley's body better than Charles Barkley understood it himself. "You can build strength," Barkley would say years later, in an interview where someone finally asked him directly about that series. "You can build size. You can build every physical tool." But Jordan built something different. He built the ability to make you predictable. And once you're predictable, it doesn't matter how big you are. It doesn't matter how strong, because he's already standing where you're going. Jordan won his third title. Barkley never got back to the finals. And in every conversation from that point forward, when someone brought up the series, when someone asked whether Barkley had genuinely scared Jordan, the answer from anyone who was close to it was always the same. He scared everyone else. Everyone watching, everyone in the dugouts and broadcast booths and front offices who had spent those first 4 games updating their understanding of what was possible. He scared the entire league. But Michael Jordan had already finished being scared before the series began. He had gone home, watched the film, done the work, found the pattern, and resolved the problem. The game was just the announcement of a conclusion that was already written.